Hello class. For today we are going to learn 11 watercolor techniques. The supplies you are going to need is your watercolor paper that is labeled with the different watercolor techniques. You're going to need a watercolor palette, a cup of watercolor, one oil pastel, any color, paper towel, and two brushes. A flat brush, which has a square tip, and a round brush that has kind of a circle round tip. Once you have these supplies, you're ready to get started. The first thing that we are going to do is we are going to fill in our area with dry brush. So find your dry brush area on your paper. And it is exactly what it sounds like. Our brush is going to be pretty dry. Now with watercolor, in order to activate the colors, we're going to need a little bit of water. So go ahead and dip your brush into the water. And then let's choose a color like brown so we can kind of simulate a fur or a hair texture. With dry brush, before you lay the paint down, you do want your brush to be the bristles to kind of be spread out in order to get this hair texture. And if you notice that your brush is a little too wet, you can dab it on your paper towel. And you can always go grab some more pigment. So for this technique, we're really going to be seeing the brush strokes in the hair of the brushes, the bristles. We can layer on this and we can get some really nice, almost fur texture. Think about other places where you could use this texture in a landscape. Could you use this for the grass? All right, so now that we've started off with dry brush, because our brush was pretty dry, we're gonna go ahead and move on to our wet on dry tile. So try to find the tile that is labeled wet on dry. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Our brush is gonna be wet, but our paper is gonna be dry. So choose any color, maybe your favorite color. One of my favorite colors is blue, so I'm gonna go with that. And I'm gonna stick with my square brush. You're welcome to switch it up to any brush. And notice how much control you have over where your paint is moving. Because the paper is dry, wherever our brush moves is where our paint's gonna move. This isn't always the case with watercolor, because a lot of times the paper is going to be wet and the water is going to spread the paints in different places, which is really pretty. So after wet on dry, what we're going to do is we're going to skip to the final step and we're going to go to the layering wet on dry. So we want to find the layering wet on dry. We're going to have two layers here. We're going to end up painting over top of a dry layer of paint. So go ahead and give yourself a nice layer of paint. We're going to come back to this after it's dry. Our next tile is going to be the wet on wet tile. Wet on wet is when you take a clean brush and you wet your paper with water. You don't want your paper to be overly saturated. You don't want the water to, if I were to pick up my paper, to drip away. You want just a nice thin layer of water. And then what you can do is you can come in with different brushes in different colors, and you can start painting over top. You can get some really nice bleeding of the paint. You can get some nice dark areas, some lighter areas. This is a really nice way to make a sky. Using the blue as the negative space, so the background, and the white would be where the clouds would go. And layering this up, you can get a really nice sky technique for a background. You can always come back and layer on this some more. One thing about watercolors, they're not as forgiving as acrylic paint. So when you lay the paint down, you can't always just paint over it and start over. You really have to be patient with the paint, and you have to figure out how watercolor moves, how these techniques work, and then you can use them as the building blocks for all different types of watercolor paintings. Right? So here we had just plain water and we painted wet paint on that wet paper. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move over to wash. So anytime in painting when we use the term wash, we're adding a lot of water to our pigment. So we're adding a lot of water to watercolor in this case. When we learn about acrylic, we're going to be adding a lot of water to our acrylics to create a wash. This is going to be very translucent. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a really, really dark watercolor just to show this technique. So in this case, I'm going to use purple. And again, I want a lot of water. More water than pigment. And I just want a nice thin wash. So I can really see through this. A wash could be a really good technique as like a top layer for your painting. A wash could be a good technique for a bottom layer. Maybe your sky could be a wash, a nice translucent wash, and then you go over top of it with your silhouettes of your trees or with birds flying in the sky. So a wash could be really good for that. A wash could be really good for a body of water, a puddle, a reflection. So think of places where you could use a nice thin layer of watercolor in your landscape, in your endangered species watercolor painting. All right, now we're going to move on to gradient. So gradient is where we go from light to dark. In this instance, I'm going to do a gradient of just one color. And I'm just going to change it up, and I'm going to go with green this time. So I'm going to start off with a lot of green on my brush. And now that I've been able to do one or two passes of green with my brush, I'm going to dilute my brush with some water. And I'm going to carry the paint down a little bit. I think I got a little bit too much water. I'm going to clean my brush some more to get a lot of my green pigment away. And I'm actually going to start at the bottom of my square with some plain water. And I'm going to go mix up into this gradient. Notice how the water is pulling some of my pigment to the bottom. I'm going to carry that back up because I want my gradient to go dark up here. So I'm going to pull my pigments. I'm moving my paint around as best as I can. I'm going to have the water work with me, not against me. And I have a nice dark section up here with all my pigments and a little bit more water down here. I can always clean my brush and move, again, some of these pigments back into another area if I'm not satisfied with where they're moving. It's your job as the artist to try to control the material. All right, so we're going from light to dark. After gradient, we're going to move on to bleeding. So bleeding can be really fun. I'm going to layer with one coat of a color. In this case, I'm going to take blue and I'm going to saturate my paper. And bleeding is when the paints will bleed, the pigments will bleed into the water. I'm going to bleed with different colors. So I've laid my blue down. I'm going to go and choose a different color like purple. I'm going to get purple on my brush and I'm going to start laying the paint down and I'm going to let it kind of spread into the other paint. If you notice, I'm not really pushing the paints around. I'm just kind of dabbing because I kind of want the paints to bleed into each other. I could even manipulate the colors a little bit more by taking just water and pulling paints around and trying to play with them bleeding into each other. I could go back to blue and have it bleed into the purple and make a nice tie-dyed effect or a very ethereal, dreamlike effect. Think about where this technique of bleeding the colors into each other could be used in your endangered species watercolor project or in any type of landscape. Could you use a little bit of bleeding in the foliage of a tree? Maybe in the feathers of a bird? So now we're going to move on to resist. So resist is when the paper is going to resist the watercolor pigment, but paper is not going to resist it. If you've noticed here, it's soaked up all of the colors. So we're going to introduce another material that's going to help resist the paint. In this case, we have oil pastels. So the oil is going to expel the water away from it and it's going to resist. So I have a white oil pastel. I'm just going to draw a couple lines on my tile so you can see where it's resisted. In some cases, if you watch some tutorials, artists will use rubber cement, which is really nice. It looks kind of like a glue material. If you've ever had packaging that's had like a little kind of like rubber sticker that you could remove and then kind of ball up in your fingers, that's rubber cement. So rubber cement is kind of like a temporary glue. With rubber cement, you can lay this on your page and you have to wait for it to dry and then you can paint over it with watercolor and you're never going to see this. So what's going to happen with the rubber cement is it's going to push away the watercolor and then we can actually peel this rubber cement up later and it will just be plain paper underneath, which is really cool. All right, so for resist, we could take any color. I haven't used red yet, so I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit of red. And I'm just going to go ahead and lay my paint down. And you might be able to see where my oil pastel was put on my page. Now the rubber cement's not dry, but I'm going to go ahead and paint over here just so you can see. And again, it's expelling and pushing away the paint. So when this is dry, if I wanted to, I could rub some of the paint away from the oil pastel on my lines. And then here I'll be able to rub away and pull the rubber cement from the paper. So So this is pretty good for borders if you want to keep a part of your page plain or protect it without using tape, because you have a very organic shape, not like a straight line. Rubber cement's really good for that. All right, now we're going to move on to a really fun one, salt. So with salt, you're just going to paint your page like you would like to. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit of green here. And you guys are going to share the salt around the room. You need just a pinch of it. You want to do a decent wash. Wait a second for the paint to dry. And then you want to take a pinch of salt, just a pinch, and drop it in your salt area. Now, what did you think was going to happen with the salt? Did you think it was going to expel it and push it away like the oil pastels? Or did you think it was going to soak it up? Is salt known for absorbing moisture? Yeah, so it's going to absorb the water, which in return is going to absorb the pigments in the water. So it's going to have some very condensed areas where the pigment is drawn to the salt. So what area in a landscape could be good for this salt technique? Could you use it for snow if you have lots of light blues? Could you use it for a sand texture at the beach? Could you use it for a scaly reptilian animal? Think about where you could use salt in your art. All right, next we're going to move on to lifting. So when we are lifting, this could be a good technique for sky. I'm going to use blue. I think I got a little bit too much pigment there, so I'm going to add a little bit of water. I don't want my brush too wet, so I'm going to use the side of my cup. There we go. And maybe I lost a little bit too much pigment. I want to get kind of like a medium pigment here for the sky. I don't want it too light like a wash, but I don't want it too saturated and dark. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually lift some of this paint up from our paper. And we can do this a couple ways. We can use materials to lift, like cloth or paper towel. And when we're lifting, we can actually use the texture of the paper towel. Like if we were to kind of manipulate the edges of the paper towel to make a really cool texture. And we can actually start to lift some of the paint up. Some artists use this again for the sky. You can start to create some clouds, cloud texture. And if it's not getting light enough for you, you can take water and you can start to move some of the pigments and lift them up again with your paper towel. And you can even take a dry brush and start to lift up some of the pigments. Again, wiping with your paper towel. Even if your paint is dry, you can take a wet paintbrush and erase a little bit of your areas. Okay, so here's a good start to a sky and some clouds. This would be nice to add some more layering to get some more details. And one thing about watercolor is the more layers you have, the more interesting the piece is going to be, because that's how this material works. You want to have at least 5 layers of watercolor in your artwork to make it really interesting. All right, we're going to move on to our 11th, well, I guess our 10th tile, but our 11th technique that we're doing right now. We are going to do layering wet on wet. So in this instance, it's very similar to bleeding. We're going to take some pigments and lay them down. So we're going to layer wet onto the wet. Our paper's wet with watercolor, not just water, so there's some pigment. And here we can add some more colors into it. And we can paint over top. And notice how the colors can also, again, bleed into each other. We can wait for this to dry a little bit more so the paper's just damp, and we can do wet on wet. And the difference between this and bleeding is where we want the colors to really merge into each other. Layering wet on wet, we don't want it as wet. We don't want it to be super saturated like bleeding. We want there to be layers of the colors on top of each other with a little bit of blending. So really we should have our first layer dry a little bit more. So I'll come back to this and do a little bit more layers over top of it. While we're waiting for this to dry, we can go back to the 3rd tile that we worked on, and we can work with the layering wet on dry. So this should be dry now. Mine is dry. And we can take wet paint and we can paint over top of it. All right, I haven't used a warm color in a while, so I'm going to go back to red. And again, we are able to get a nice bright red over top of our blue. Or whatever colors you chose, because they're not blending into each other. So I'm going to go back to my layering wet on wet. I still have a little bit too much pigment. It's still a little too wet. But you guys should be able to notice the difference where the pigments are going to kind of blend a little bit more here versus in our wet on dry, where there are 2 different layers. So there you have it. You have all these different techniques. These are the building blocks to creating watercolor paintings. So think about how you can use these techniques in your projects. All right, make sure when you guys clean up that the watercolor palettes sit at this orientation, because there is water still in the pigments. We don't want them to be upside down and drip everywhere inside of the containers. So we'll put these back in the bins face up like this. If you use the rubber cement, make sure the lid is back on nice and tight. The last person used the salt, please bring it back up to the front. Oil pastels need to go back in the oil pastel bucket. And your paintbrushes, make sure you rinse them in the sink. Dump your water cup in the sink, rinse it out, and put those away. And our watercolor techniques worksheets are going to go on the drying rack by the door. All right, thank you guys.